All right. Well, welcome to the 9th episode in Rethinking Religion. We've been on feels like a wonderful journey. I think it's meandered in different ways, but it's always kept a thread. And I'm really enjoying where we've been able to go so far. Where we left off last time is maybe taking a deeper look at how aesthetics and art relate to ritual. And also possibly to mystical states or esoteric dimensions of spirituality. So I think that's where we'll start, and then we might broaden the lens a little bit to look at practices in general, because that was also something that we were exploring. And before I launch into that, I want to just do a little brief introduction for it. But before I say that, I just want to say congratulations, John, on the launch of After Socrates.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. And this gives me opportunity to thank you both in particular. Of course, you can obviously see how the conversations we've been having are weaving into After Socrates. I hope you can see that very readily. And so thank you so much for that.
It's an honor. Yeah. And I've watched the first 2 episodes and also the long 3-hour talk you did on Neoplatonism and all excellent stuff. So
thank you. Thanks, Zevi Slavin, for putting together that simultaneous release. I really like this. I like this idea of this simultaneous, interrelating, release of complementary videos on a shared topic. I thought that was brilliant. I think we should think about doing that, something similar. I think it's an excellent thing.
Wonderful. All right, so in thinking about, there are a couple approaches, and I think Layman and you, I'm sure we'll all have our own little angles to take on it and see where we go from there. One thing that I was thinking about, just from my own practice background, is thinking about the development or the evolution of the relationship to art, imagery, mythology within the Buddhist tradition. And I think it's worth mentioning because it's not unique to Buddhism. I think it can be extrapolated out into other contexts. So in the very beginning of the birth of Buddhism, there was a kind of bracketing or rejection of the naive, pre-critical kind of holding of myth within the popular culture. And so Buddhism took mostly an analogical approach to a lot of the existing myths. It would say, okay, well, we can talk about this, but they clearly framed it in rationalistic terms as this stands for that. And there was a kind of austerity or spareness around imagery and representation and form, with some exceptions. There's some new scholarship coming out that there were corners where there was already some kind of rich, still artistic practice and mystical framing. But in a lot of the early Theravada, there was a more austere approach around that. And then with the birth of Mahayana, there was a kind of explosion of the mythic imagination, a reinvigoration of the mythic imagination, I think in part fueled by the concept of emptiness and the emptiness of form and form as expression of emptiness, that there was a welcoming of the free play of mythical representation and extravagant pictures. And you can find really outrageous and beautiful representations in the myths and explosion of color and mandalic forms and all of that. So from there, that kind of welcoming, a kind of second naivete, maybe a recours kind of second naivete of welcoming that back again for a different kind of play. Then beyond that, with Tantra, the Vajrayana, secret Mantrayana, where there was a recognition that from the mind that is resting, that has clear insight into emptiness of phenomena, and the mind that is resting in that perception of the emptiness of phenomena, unified with compassion. That was a particular context there, but that from within that framework, the forms and the aesthetics and the ritual all are not merely analogical. They're not even kind of the mythical and imaginal, but they're almost sacramental, in that in their manifestation, they point not only to ideas or concepts, but to actually the very state and the very phenomenal field in which the enactment is taking place. So there's a transparency between the representation and the actual cognitive operations and the states and the qualities that are present in, and that are desired. And so then the mythic forms and the images and the representations have the function of heightening particular qualities that are desired within, contemplative context. So just, one small example would be, there might be a representation of Kuntuzangpo as a regent in Yabyum with his consort, surrounded by a royal household, and there are vassals and functionaries and guards, and they're all arranged in particular ways in this visualization that you might do, very elaborate, very colorful. But for instance, they're like the crossed legs of the couple in Yabyum, or the vassals surrounding, and those have both a static meaning. The crossed legs mean the union of compassion and clear perception of the openness of reality, emptiness. So it's pointing directly to that state of mind that they want to cultivate in that moment and actually enact the ritual within. But also there's more of a dynamic representation, that the one leg crossing over the other is, in a sense, representing the control of the affective states in order to transform them into what they would consider pristine cognitions. So there's a posture within the act of the ritual where the colors and the images and the forms that you're working with are meant to evoke particular range of feelings and affect states, but they're done in a way that actually is controlled, so that they can be sublimated and serve higher functions, that they're not merely arising on the emotional level. And within the Indian context, the whole rasa theory around the taste and how aesthetics and art is supposed to evoke different, at least 7 different shadras, the 7 different emotional states or qualities. These are all recognized as having not only kind of like utility on the emotional and moral and interactive level, but a secret or subtle or esoteric dimension that relates to high-level contemplative states. And if they could be marshaled within first the interpersonal and interactive sphere, then they can be channeled and sublimated into higher contemplative realizations that help you stabilize in very, very rarefied states. So there's that whole complex interdimensionality of what's going on, where there's a kind of self-referentiality and a anchoring of the consciousness, the desired qualities of consciousness within a creative and colorful framework.
That was impressive. I guess sort of a couple of things, maybe 3 emerge. I want to put this in. The imagery, of course, starts to come in. The artistic representations start to come in when Buddhism, of course, comes into contact with Greek culture and Bactria. Right, the first images are actually made probably by Greeks of the Buddha.
The Maurya culture interacting.
And so, and then of course it gets carried into China, and this is all sort of emerging with the co-emergence of the Silk Road and other things. And there's something there about this that I think is important. The degree to which I don't think it's happenstance is what I'm saying. I think that whenever we're trying to be importantly cross-cultural, the imaginal has to take a significant role in getting that bridging between the propositions and the non-propositional. And of course, the Silk Road, there's a philosophical analog to the physical Silk Road that was taking shape, and I've been arguing about this. And so I want to bring out that the imaginal may have a particular pertinence now in a global civilization in which the cross-cultural takes a prominence that it did not have before. And so that's a first proposal I want to put out, that there might be a kind of centrality to the imaginal in a way that was not necessarily the case before, because while the cross culture became present, that's a historical example, it wasn't as pronounced as it is for us now. What has been called the problem of pluralism is a pronounced problem for us. And so I'm suggesting we consider the fact that the imaginal may have a more pivotal role than it has had in the past, precisely because it faces this problem in an exigent manner and an extensive manner that was not faced before. So that's the first basic proposal. The second proposal is, I guess, a philosophical reflection that in associating the images with the imaginal, and I mean by that we participate in them, and we look through them, and by means of them to augment our conception, our perception, etc., of reality, imaginally augmented perception. And this overlaps with a lot of what Jennings and other people have called ritual knowing. We can talk a little bit more about that. The two questions now come out for that. One is, what's the relationship between the aesthetics of the imaginal and the rationality of the imaginal? What's the normative standard, and is there any normativity to it? I would argue that there is a rationality, there's a rational standard to ritual, and I would like to explore what that has to do with any normativity on the imaginal. What are the constraints on it? And then relate that back to the first question, because presumably getting a deeper understanding of the normativity on the ritual imaginal could help us better understand how it could face the cross-cultural demand. So the 2 points are linked. The third is linked, but more in a contrastive fashion. The way we're talking about the aesthetic here is deeply opposed to sort of the post-Enlightenment tradition of taking the aesthetic up as the thing in itself that we have a disinterested relationship to, right? You're not looking at the painting for anything beyond the painting. It's for its own sake. In fact, it can be non-representational, etc. And I'm not here to deny that there can be non-representational art. I'm just pointing out about a tradition, and that our relationship one is the normative relationship. The Kantian, right, is a disinterested, that it puts us in a state of disinterest. We're beyond our concerns. And there's a part of this that's undeniable, which is, we're getting beyond our egocentric preferences, but it seems to not call us into participation in anything, in any way other than a kind of purely, I don't know what to call it. This isn't the right word, but something like a purely sensual engagement with the work of art, just as a work of art. And what we're talking about here seems to be directly challenging that. It was saying, no, these traditions, look at how they're taking the art up. It's not, you're not supposed to be a disinterested observer, appreciating the texture of the painting and the way the artist is clearly, breaking frame. Like, you're supposed to get involved with it insofar as it's transforming your relationship to yourself, the depths of your psyche and the depths of reality. So those are the 3 points: the cross-cultural point, the normativity point and the connections with rationality, around the imaginal ritual, the ritual imaginal. And I think imaginal is a proper part of ritual. And then third, how this actually talks in a way that's in distinction to, in contrast to, the post-Enlightenment tradition around aesthetics. So those are the 3 things I would want to put on the table.
Well, so many good things there. I think it's interesting that we associate history with written language so much because writing is such a powerful tool. But for most of our history as symbolic communicators, we were not using writing. We were using imagery or sculpture.
Yeah, yes.
And that it was conceived to be a form of communication, and presumably a form of communication of something that was deeply useful and relevant to the people receiving the communication. So this attempt to make it merely arbitrary or merely aesthetic is problematic. I think you're right that the imaginal plays a special role or a renewed role where there's the context of creative intercultural exchanges. I think probably we see that at different phases through history, and something like the Silk Road, but many other phases as well, tell us something about what we ought to be doing now. Bruce, I think you're quite right about the way in which the representations demonstrate the states needed for the ritual enactments, and also sometimes the content of the representations that are pointing toward the states are taken from ritual enactments, whether they be esoteric or social rituals. I like all of that. And the thing that's coming up for me is that I want to challenge a little bit is the tendency to over rely on static visuals as the dominant mode of the aesthetics. So the thing I'm thinking of is let's say tone and tempo. Maybe tempo is one of the most overlooked aspects of the way ritual and aesthetics interact. Where you can perform a ritual by agreeing to undergo the pattern, but there's a whole other level of performance where you do it at a certain speed that produces an altered state and reinvokes that altered state in the observers. One of the things I point out to people sometimes as a teaching instruction is we all know how to pretend to do Tai Chi. There's a certain feedback modulated tempo. There's a number of different ways to think about what that means as an inherited neurophysiological mode. But that tempo, we slow things down just enough to be able to do something for ourselves and for others with those ritual enactments. And I think it also changes the context of our relationship to time. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I can readily imagine a very early human civilization where a person is sacralizing an object, which is partly to make it available for future ritual use by simply holding it up or placing it in a certain speed of performance. Nietzsche talks about the way we can challenge ourselves with the idea of the eternal recurrence. And one other way to language that is how we can provoke our consciousness with the sense of indefinite duration. Because I think that particular aspect of the sacred participatory mode that is tempo feels like we're making the gesture for all worlds and for all times, that we're performing in the supra-historical environment that we are imaginally co-enacting. So that's the first thing that comes up for me.
I just wanted to reinforce that, which was why I went off camera. I'm not sure how to pronounce this name, and so if I mispronounce it, I apologize. Dimitri Zigliatis, I believe, new book out on ritual, and he's really interesting. He's a cognitive scientist, bringing both qualitative and quantitative methods. But to your point, Layman, he talks about firewalking and that there is the aspect of tempo. The way you firewalk is you have to walk at just the right speed. If you walk too fast, you'll kick stuff up and burn yourself. And if you walk too slow, the slow conductance from the hot coal will actually penetrate your feet. You have to get this little sweet spot of timing, and so you have to get into basically you're getting into a flow state, hyper concentration and focus to get this very specific timing, so that you can actually do the firewalking ritual. And that sense of being put into that altered timing is, of course, what is so powerful about the ritual. So I just wanted to reinforce your sense there. There's been, he's done a lot of participant observation measurement around this aspect of timing as very crucial, and that we put there's demands, put a whole system of constraints, and it's actually embedded in just the physics of the fire, the coal fire, right? The embers, to get that focus on timing and make. You can see the flow state, clear signal, tightly coupled feedback, error matters, all the flow induction states, and then they really get you into the timing. And so I just wanted to reinforce your point and say there's really good current published research around exactly that aspect, the timing aspect, the tempo aspect of ritual being really, really central to it.
Yeah, I'd throw in one more thing, Bruce, which is that we see the way slow motion is used in cinema. Echoes this a little bit as well. Whether it's sexuality or violence, there's an additional level of salience that's added by slowing it down slightly. And it, I think, entrains everyone's nervous system to become more of a participant.
And this makes me think of Han's work in The Scent of Time, and how we've lost the ability to linger in time. We've atomized time, and time is whizzing for us. Whereas rituals reintroduce us back to like that Bergsonian durée, that lingering in, where the tightly coupled to the flow, to the timing is crucial, rather than moving through the order as efficiently or as rapidly as we possibly can. I agree. I think that's I think the aesthetics about that, and that's why I kept saying the imaginal ritual. as I was very much thinking of things that were being enacted. And we have very good evidence that as soon there was a third thing that was present. There's the images and there's the sculpture. And we have very good evidence that music was also present in the Upper Paleolithic transition. We've got good evidence that there was dancing, good evidence that there were musical instruments, etc. And music, I think, is the epitome of everything we're talking about here, the aesthetics of pure salience and pure timing and pure involvement and pure movement, all for their own sake. And I think part of what led to, like, it's easy to talk like in a Kantian fashion about disinterested observation about a painting. I find people can't do that as readily with music, because the way music does not land cleanly on one side or the other of the subjective objective divide. For me, music is prototypically transjective in a way that's really, really important. So I'm not saying anything new here. I'm really trying to enrich and maybe even enhance, I hope, what Layman is saying. I think we should make sure that the aesthetics doesn't devolve because of our Greek heritage onto the static pictorial. We should be much more encompassing, and we should always think of it as a ritual aesthetics and not just image aesthetics. If that's how I'm understanding you, Layman.
Yeah, there's again so much there. We each have so much to pick up from. There are a number of things coming to mind for me. I think that's a really important dimension. When I was thinking about maybe broadening out to talk about the important suites of practices that we need to include, I definitely was including music and dance and other things in that. I think, obviously we've talked about before, ritual creating a kind of a removed sacred container, a generative kind of container that's outside of the normal flow of things, in which you could say, I sometimes talk about a ritual and practice as creating what I call a generative enclosure. And that generative enclosure has kind of light amplifying qualities. It can take whatever is habitually present in us and amplify it in a way that we can have new insight into it. One of the means of doing that is through rhythm and tempo. And I can think of my experience in Malaysia at intensive 2-week retreats, and in those retreats, 18 hours a day, you would either be meditating or doing slow walking, or absolutely everything that you did during the day, you do in extreme slow motion, eating, showering, everything. So you basically slow everything down in a very intensified way over 18 hours a day, and then just a little window of sleep and then up again to do it. And that radically changes your experience of time. But it also, I think, it creates a special container in which everybody's moving in a different rhythm, and it establishes a field. But that slowing down of the tempo allows for insight that doesn't have to be communicated verbally. Mm-hmm. When you slow down, you can see the different kind of schemas that are operative in your habitual way of doing things, because at the slowed down pace, what normally happens in an instant happens in a broader time, and you can see kind of the different factors that assemble in yourself to make that perception or movement or decision happen. It all gets clarified in a particular way. So it serves not only the generative field, the creation of a generative field, but also serves the facilitation of insight that doesn't have to be communicated verbally or pictorially. And one other piece I just wanted to add on there is just the opposite side of that is something like in the Sudic tradition, Sudicism or African-American personalism. They have a critique of transpersonal psychology, which is that it always focuses on silence and stillness and balance. They're saying there's a whole other way of going about things, which is what they call the interpersonal dynamic, where they're wanting to create a field of harmony among individuals through activation, through nomo, the power of the spoken word and rhythm and ritual and dance that leads to possession states. But from within that framework, they don't see the individuals as getting possessed and taken over by another entity, but that the rhythm allows you to possess certain heightened qualities and participate in them deliberately. So anyway, those are two things I wanted to add in there.
I mean, playing with the timing, serious play with the timing, I think is really important if we accept, which I've argued we should, that cognition is not a formal system, but a dynamical system. And dynamical system altering timing alters the functionality of the system in a profound way and can be revelatory. And you want to use the technical language, you want to perturb it to the extremes so you can explore the shape of the state space that it can get into. Right. I think there's good cog sci for everything you just said there, Bruce. So I just wanted to put that in about that. And I mean, this is sort of the Apollonian and Dionysian of Nietzsche. Again, I guess the thing that comes up for me then is kind of a proposal around the normativity, because I think this is implicit in what we're saying, and I want to propose it more explicitly and see what you both have to think about it. Is that part of to say that we have I'm going to say ritual now, ongoing, right? But I always mean the imaginal within the ritual, and the imaginal doesn't have to be an image; it can be music, etc. Right? Okay, so the aesthetics of it is, that it's a good bidirectional bridge. A ritual is good if it can conduce people into the generative framework where there's imaginal augmentation of their perceptual and conceptual and dialogical powers. But it should, and this is Jennings and Bryan and Shilbright, it should also conduce them well out into the aspects of their lives that are not ritualized and be generative and revelatory in all of those domains there as well. And that to the degree to which it is well developed to conduce in and conduce out, educing in both poles, it conduces between the poles and educes within them, then I think we can say this is a powerful, good ritual. And in that sense, it's beautiful, and one that lacks to some degree on the directionality of having both directions, or only educes in one and doesn't transfer to the other. I think those are basis for criticizing, because if all of this discussion doesn't give us a way, because this is what all the religions do, they have a way of saying, that's good, do more of that. That's going to lead you down a dark path. Don't do that. And so if we're talking about rethinking religion, we have to, I think we are obligated in the sense that there's a demand on us to meet the demand that other religions have met about properly trying to articulate what the criteria would be. And I've just tried to propose a couple there. You've got a bidirectional conduction, and you've got powerful eduction on both poles, right? And that's a very good ritual. I'm not saying that's exhaustive. This was meant to be exemplary and to see if that lands in order to encourage other reflection upon what it is we're looking for when we would. On what basis could we in an epistemically and morally justifiable fashion recommend a ritual to someone? That's my way of thinking about it.
Yeah, the normative imaginal dimension of ritual seems like the one that has the most untapped treasures to find.
That's you have a gift for putting a very positive framing on something that has been very problematic. That is very beautiful. Well done. Well done.
So I'm thinking of what are the possible normative dimensions? Like there's possibly a normative tempo. There are possibly normative morphologies. I think that one probably is worth drilling down into, because European occultism, Neoplatonism, but also all the way back to the first records of civilization, certain geometries were being used. Yes, and they are recurrent, and they allow people they have a certain binding quality that isn't merely the arbitrary work of the individual imagination.
Yes.
And then they show up in ritual, and they also show up in the aesthetics we're putting forward. So I think geometry is going to end up being an important piece of this. There's, I think, to Bruce's first point, normative state production and the aesthetics associated with that. And that would be anchored to personal and interpersonal practical outcomes in terms of empowerment. But also there's something like a meta consideration, which is what's the context in which people are performing the ritual? Because
Yeah.
I would be more likely to encourage people to participate in a ritual if I felt like the space had the kind of metacognitive fluidity of holding it tightly, but not too tightly, where there
Mhm.
could be humor around the considerations, where the spirit of the people was open and not contracted. Then even if they were doing something I thought was not imaginally verified in the ritual, I would expect them to do it well and evolve toward a more reliable ritual. Whereas if they were doing it in a mode of identification or contraction or simple conformity, then even if the structure was really good, I would be worried about recommending that, because the mode
Right.
we approach the imaginal forms in
Right,
makes it-
right. Good points. Do you think what you just said is in consonant with what I just proposed too, about this sort of bidirectional conduction and then the power to adduce within the ritual and also without the ritual? Do you think that that's consonant, that those two go together as a proposal?
Yeah, very much so. And the bit that I think is closest there is where I talked about the normative state production associated with
Yeah.
the outcomes in personal
Yeah.
and interpersonal realms.
Yeah.
Because obviously, I mean, that's a way to kind of vet it over time, is we feel like we've got a really good grasp on this, but down the road, if people doing it are having bad outcomes, then we're not doing it right.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. This brings out a tension within the anthropology of ritual knowing. When you ask people who are participating in the ritual, they'll say that ritual never changed. They do it because this is the way it's always been done. But we have overwhelming evidence that rituals change. So what you have is there's this evolution, but it happens in such a way that nobody realizes that it's happening, which is a really interesting thing. And I think I think part of what you're talking about when you said, I want to get a sense that it has that kind of you don't want sort of patently obvious evolution, because then if people will game it, they'll game it. Right. But you don't want it to be just static. Like you said, you don't want to just be finding that sweet spot. And what does it look like? And that's really, really interesting.
My parents were both really good landscapers. And when I was a teenager, I realized this because they would change the property and I would look at it and I couldn't remember what it was like before. It seemed like it so well. I thought, oh, they must be good at this.
Exactly. That's exactly. There's something about, we change it, but it's a masterpiece. And so we don't change it. Right. It's both of those. Sorry, we're talking a lot. We should let Bruce talk, Layman.
Is it okay? I was thinking of one thing because I'm doing work with Steve March.
Oh, excellent. Aletheia coaching.
Yes. And I think one of the elements that, I think has grounding in cognitive science, and that's useful. I've been to many retreats and rituals where you do it and then it's over and you're thrust into conventional world. And it's basically, it kind of erases what's happened. And so the idea,
it's a vacation. It's not an education. Yeah,
exactly. Right. So if there is something that deliberately involves your engagement after the enactment, especially within that 5-hour memory reconsolidation window, would be, I think, a key thing for empowering many different ritual forms. If there is some kind of, in the good communities I've been part of, you do the ritual, but there's also ongoing, contact with the teachers and with the others, so that there is a feeling of continuity. A lot of times people go to church and then they forget it for 7 days, or whatever, and it doesn't land anywhere. So if there was something that could serve memory reconsolidation through a kind of re-engagement or instruction to connect to aspects of the ritual within a particular period after the enactment, I think that would help with an anchoring.
I think that does. I think you need to then you've got to set up a framework, a philosophical semiotic framework that coordinates the practices, the rituals done with others, and then one's daily practices. Like I was brought up a Christian. You went to church, but church didn't mean anything if you didn't do your daily devotions, right? And for whatever degree I've rejected the metaphysical propositions, that has stuck with me as like, that's the case. That's really the case, right? And so you need, and that's a tricky thing to do. because you can't have sort of practices of like you can't just, you've got to have a framework, a philosophical semiotic framework that justifies and explains and encourages the relationship between, let's call them the communal ritual and the daily devotional ritual, and integrates them together and says why both are needed and how they talk to each other and how you carry one into the other. I think you need that, which is again part of the larger argument I've been making, that ecologies of practices have to be homed within proper communities, within frameworks, right? And I think one of the reasons why Tai Chi works for me is because it is set within the Taoist framework that helps me take the practices and transfer them out into non-Tai Chi situations in a powerful way, because there's a framework, a philosophical semiotic framework that bridges. I think if you have the communal practices and the daily, the communal rituals and the daily devotional rituals, and then you have a bridging framework like that, I think that's what will encourage it to take and to transfer. And then the difficulty with doing that then is, the practical difficulty we face is we face something that the past traditions didn't face, or at least maybe they did, but maybe not as, as saliently as we do. It's just a tremendous competition for people's time and attention that's on offer right now. Like, I've had people comment on my videos, and they'll say, "Look, if I have to read all the books and do all these practices, I wouldn't be watching the video." And it's like, you don't understand what I'm trying to do here. You really don't understand what I'm trying to do here. I am not going to give the secret thing the secret technique. Like, the whole point is, no, I'm making an argument that you have to do this in a committed and dexterous fashion, or it's not going to make any difference to you. So I don't know. For me, Bruce, what you're saying means we need the philosophical semiotic framework that bridges between the communal practice and the daily devotion.
Yeah, there's something I wanted to maybe just add real quick there. One, I think the West, in its fascination, especially with Eastern or different esoteric traditions, has learned and matured over the last several decades. At first, it just wanted the techniques and it wanted the immediate states.
Yeah.
And I think humbly, we've come to gradually learn that even if we look down so-called on the metaphysics of those traditions, there was a lot of wisdom in a lot of the ways that the elements played together, even if it was unconscious or unarticulated wisdom. And my wife is going through that with her rediscovery of a lot of the wisdom in her Hindu practices that she was raised in, but that she rejected for a while. But one thing I was thinking of that's kind of maybe broadening us out to a little bit more of the practices in general is speaking about that semiotic framework and what role does an integral spirituality, or what role does a religion that's not a religion play socially. And one of the things that I've seen, and that I think the way it's manifested in the integral world, is it's played three different roles. And I'm interested to bring that up to see if anything's missing or what you think about that, and how complementarily a religion that not a religion would play a role. One is that it's more of the integral framework is more of an adjunct or a symbiotic relationship with existing traditions. It gives a framework and a set of interpretations and an expanded model of practices that any existing tradition can use to reflect on its own status and its own fullness, and possibly as adjuncts to what it's already doing, and possibly a reframing of what it's already doing. For instance, even with kind of your discussion of Neoplatonism, if you went out to the Hermetic, order, the Golden Dawn, they probably would not see Neoplatonism in the way that you're talking about it. They would hold it in a much more metaphysical way. I have friends who are in that, and they've left it because they couldn't find people willing to be in a consonant dialogue with science. So there's a reframing that can happen, right? The second is for the integral spiritual approach, or to serve as its own practice vehicle with its own set of practices, its own general soteriology, its own community and ritual base as an independent thing. Third is it plays a mediating role between domains, not only between different traditions, but also between, science or art or other dimensions of society, where it tries to enact a kind of mesh weaving or translative role within society that can help with the integration of different elements within the social order.
I think that's excellent, what you just articulated. I guess perhaps I would want to add in it should have an intergenerational function, right? A proper intergenerational function. And in sort of analogous to that, hearkening back to an original point, proper cross-cultural function, which probably overlaps with the first function, but isn't quite identical to it. And so those were the two I would want to add to that it should have those proper functions as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to me to think about the arena of European occultism, because it's easy to disparage it, and there's a lot of good reasons to do that. It has cultic and fantastical elements, and it's in a tense relationship to the dominant political and religious experiences going on in those cultures. But I think what we see there are attempts to do something like what we're discussing, right? We're seeing people use imagination. We're seeing people come together in an intercultural, transdisciplinary context of scientific illuminism, trying to create rituals, trying to be connected to the past, trying to set it up intergenerationally, right? Many of these things have failed, and many of these things have been like houses for a lot of tendencies that aren't really very good for people. But nonetheless, what they've tried to do and why they haven't succeeded, I think, is a very interesting area of study for moving this kind of project forward. The other thing that came up for me is, thinking about this sort of philosophical semiotic framing or intermediary. I'm tempted to say philosophical, semiotic, and somatic. Yes. One of the things, like if somebody's watching your thing going, why do I have to track Socrates? Just tell me where he is, John. Right? They're in a way, they're too lost in the digital information, and they're not remembering their body, right? They're not remembering that their body has to go through it. And then likewise, the body has to be the right kind of container for the energies, let's say, that are released through ritual enactment. Otherwise, we get carried away if we can't be good containers for that. And I would add one extra thing, which is a sort of a separate topic, which is the content of the patterns of the ritual. I think there's many sort of subspecies of how to describe that patterning. And one of the options seems to be to present what we think the patterns of the production of insight or depth are, and to show that through a dramaturgical performance so that everyone has that in their mind. Right. So that the better we can produce, say, a cognitive science mapping of what it's like for someone to learn or grow in a moment, right, the more we can verify whether the ritual is demonstrating that and allowing people to live that out and then carry that pattern with them into their lives.
That was brilliant. And I want to, first of all, express gratitude that there are people like you with your astute competence studying the occult world, because I can't do it. I go as far into that world as more than many academics would. I'll hope you'll grant me that. But most of that stuff is simultaneously irritating and unintelligible to me. And you're nodding because but part of what I'm saying is I acknowledge your point, and I think your point is a gem of a point. We need people like you who are competent and careful enough to do that reflection and bring out, for many of us who cannot, what can be learned from that enormous laboratory of attempting to do the stuff we're talking about. I think that's an excellent point, and I just wanted to express appreciation. Like, you have the ability to make a lot of this stuff not only intelligible, but like recommended for reflection that I have not seen in many individuals. Like you'll talk about stuff that I normally will ignore because the people who talk about it say gibberish, and you say, and almost intentionally so, by the way, and you do exactly the opposite without being condescending, but with empathy and compassion. So I just want to congratulate you and express my appreciation, encourage you to keep going at that, because I think your point about how that needs to be brought into this discussion is right. But what I'm adding is we need the right people to bring it into the discussion, and you're exemplary of that.
I will second that for sure. Yeah, I really feel that about him. And there's some really interesting work that's only tentatively, at least it's not easily available, but I've come across some work by David Michael Levin, who's done a lot of work on, somatic approaches to philosophy and spiritual transformation.
Yeah.
But he's taken some deep looks at alchemy and Western esoteric tradition and done a kind of reframing. And I think, John, you're doing that in a way with the Neoplatonic tradition. There are a lot of people in the postmodern academic world who have some interest in spirituality who will out of the gate totally reject Neoplatonism. And that's one of the reasons that Wilbur took a lot of heat, is he brought so much Neoplatonist assumptions in the background of his work.
Yeah.
But I think you're giving it an articulation that also makes it digestible and actually seem worth engaging.
Thank you for saying that. That's what I aspire to do with the help of some really talented people and collaborators. So yeah, I think Vers Lewis is right about Neoplatonism. It is the spiritual backbone of, I would now not only say the West, but I would put Vers Lewis together with Thomas Plant, the West and the Silk Road. And that is something we can't ignore it. We can't just return to it. I acknowledge that the critiques establish that, I think, but we have to exact it. We have to exact it. I think that's not optional for us. And so I aspire to do that well. That's why I'm here with you gentlemen. I like every time I talk, you both have insights that just strike me as profound and brilliant, and it's great to be here doing this. Well, gentlemen, I need to be going soon, and I'm wondering if we could perhaps wrap it up, because I don't want to just leave abruptly.
Yeah, I feel like we've covered some good ground. I think it's we actually need to get better at making more pithy and digestible material instead of
Yes. Yeah.
2-hour deep dive. So I think people will appreciate this as a little gem of an exploration here.
Yeah,
I'd like us to mark something we can use as the leaping off point for next time, maybe from each of us. And I think the thing that I said about the possibility of examining ritual enactments through the lens of whether or not they closely demonstrate cognitive science vetted analyses of the process of transformation. I'd like to pick that up next time.
That's exactly where I wanted to go. This book has been deeply, powerfully influential on me. Shilbrack, Thinking Through Ritual, and there's an intended play on words in the title. And the stuff about ritual knowing, the rationality of ritual metaphysics, a metaphysics that is only accessible it can't be reduced to anything else, a metaphysics that's only accessible through ritual, the normativity on that, and the way that lines up with cog sci, especially for ecog sci. That is something I would love to dive into deeply.
Yeah, I'm very interested in that as well. So I think that sounds like a good jumping off point. I'm developing a course right now that's going to be looking very much on, embodied practice. So may want to bring in some element of the somatic into that exploration.
Yeah.
And I'm engaging recently with the work of Richard Kearney around carnal hermeneutics. And one of the things that he's kind of taking up is the kind of some of the Greek emphasis on the visual as the primary metaphor. And he's looking back to Aristotle, but to other sources where the tact and touch is actually really a key turning point for an embodied hermeneutics. So we might get into that some.
That sounds fantastic. That's, that goes to Taylor's notion of the difference between a representational and a contact epistemology. Very much. I'd love to be involved in that.
Great.
Terrific. Then I'll say again how nice it is to see the new series, John. And
Thank you.
Robert Gray asked me if we could do a discussion series around it going forward. And I also put an article on the Emerge website about it. And we're thinking about having Bruce come into those response discussions about the videos.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you so much. That's exactly what I want to be done with this series. That's exactly it. So thank you so much for doing that. I really appreciate it. Touches me deeply. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. Look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yeah.
Take good care, my friends.
Be well.
Okay.